The question of the so-called parting of the ways, the separation between Christianity and Judaism in antiquity, is one of the most debated issues in the study of early Christianity. Prior to the moment of alleged parting, the paths on which Judaism and Christianity, the twins in Rebecca's womb, were about to tread separately, are supposed to have been one and the same, in spite of grievances on both sides. Scholars of early Christianity have highlighted the struggles for authority that motivated the efforts of Christian writers to change the state of affairs by drawing and patrolling the borders of religious identity. With little to differentiate the two groups objectively, those heresiologists used the rhetorical weaponry to distance themselves from any form of kinship with the Jews. A comparably extensive anti-Christian polemic is absent from the late ancient rabbinic corpus, leading some to suppose a conspiratorial silence on the part of the rabbis. However, discoveries about the belatedness with which the rabbinic worldview solidified have bolstered the idea that Christianity and Judaism continue to be, if not indistinguishable, at least substantially infused well into late antiquity. The question, when and how did Christianity emerge out of its Jewish matrix, is deceptively simple. When it is posed, what is often omitted is the criterion according to which, or the rubric under which, it is to be pursued. What exactly do we mean when we reference the moment of parting? Are we speaking of the point at which members of the two communities cease to see each other as belonging to the same collective? Or are we referring, for example, to a time when they stopped doing similar things or thinking similar thoughts within a particular domain? In the quest to discover the origins of Christian-Jewish estrangement, attempts to locate a split in the 1st and 2nd century have now generally given way to an emphasis on the lack of historical evidence for an early severance. In recent decades, the metaphor of the ways that never parted, also the title of an edited volume of deservedly great success, has been used to signal that an unbroken continuum between the two traditions persisted until a late date. But even within this new paradigm, positing a late, gradual, and geographically heterogeneous separation, disagreements continue regarding the nature of the relations between ancient Jesus-following Jews and Gentiles and non-Jesus-following Jews. Students of ancient anti-Jewish literature, for example, have reached diametrically opposed conclusions about whether the sentiments of hostility expressed in early Christian treatises should be considered products of real-life interactions between the two communities or mere collections of commonplaces. Meanwhile, the category of Jewish Christianity, used to describe phenomena that escaped an increasingly unsparing logic of dichotomous opposition between Christianity and Judaism, has been criticized for implicitly reinscribing Jew and Christian as stable identities by constructing their hybrid as an exception. The general realization that Jews and Christians did not definitively part ways in the 2nd or even 3rd century has led to the 4th century being considered the 1st century of Judaism and Christianity. It is so with good reasons. Under the sway of imperial politics finally enforcing a single truth, Jewry was progressively estranged from a community with which it had long been identified. New historical narratives are often the product of the application of new combinations of scales and lenses to the same past phenomena. Choosing as the main rubric of investigation the ways of knowing of Jews and Christians, in this video I would like to propose that the theological debates of the 4th century, commonly known as Trinitarian, were uniquely crucial in the emergence of clear demarcations between the two communities. In doing so, I also propose recasting the parting of the ways between Christianity and Judaism as the separation of two intellectual traditions. In any time of controversy, social and intellectual fields are torn by sectarianism and even violence. Controversies, however, may also function as unwitting rituals through which communities, eventually reconciled, set their broadest boundaries. The discursive field is thus constituted through a divisive intellectual exchange. At the end of the Trinitarian controversies, the intellectual borders of imperial Christendom coincided to a substantial extent with those of the battlefield within which the strife had taken place. Any subjects who preferred staying out of the dispute, considering that there was nothing at stake for them in the fight to establish Christ's identity in ontological terms, would be in effect sanctioning their estrangement from the intellectual field of imperial Christendom. This was naturally the choice made by non-Jesus following Jews. All the doctrinal options under consideration during the 4th century Trinitarian debates were able to be reconciled with at least part of the set of beliefs that tied Christianity to the legacy of Judaism. What furthered the departure of Christianity from Judaism during the course of those debates was not the affinity for any particular theological content, but rather the rise of Christian theology as a manner of inquiry, embodied in particular methods and practices for the generation of knowledge about the divine. This narrative has some self-avowed limitations, such as its abstracting from geocultural specificities and from social stratification. However, in addition to being, of course, capable of being corrected through the application of a different lens, the generalization pursued here does not prevent later nuancing on a different, smaller scale in order to gain a more granular vision of local or class-specific realities. It is evident that this retelling of the parting of the ways assigns a certain priority of historical causality to the Jesus-following side of the Christian-Jewish continuum. The momentousness of the turn that Constantine impressed upon Christianity by initiating a process of integration between the church and the imperial government cannot be overstated. But by populating the political and institutional record with the practices of the Christian intellectual class, it becomes possible to chip away at the image of an emperor who willed Christianity and Judaism into being with a stroke of his stylus, by drawing between them the enforceable border of orthodoxy. On the other hand, friendly imperial policies were instrumental to the independent constitution of a Christian intellectual tradition, as Constantine's decisions facilitated the embedment of Christian thinkers' burgeoning working methods into an institutional structure singularly privileged by political power. This model may appear irreconcilable with the theory set forth by Daniel Boyarin over the course of many years, which has been gaining widespread acceptance and was articulated most sharply in a recent book titled Judaism. According to this view, only after Christianity constituted itself as such, in opposition to Romanitas, thus creating the category of religion, did Christians apply that category to the Jews. In doing so, Christians constituted the Jews, an ethnic group bound only by its doings, into a religion, and as Boyarin argues, drawing on the work of David Nuremberg, a wrong-headed religion, representing an antitype of Christianity. It has appeared to some that if this argument is accepted, it becomes impossible to speak of the parting, as no Judaism would have been there for Christianity to splinter off from at the time of its emergence. This conclusion seems unwarranted. We are dealing here with two separate questions. The first concerns the observable difference between the doings of the two communities, regardless of which doings are taken as the object of examination. The other touches on the rhetorical demarcation of identity and production of difference between the two communities, with boundary policing as its sinister correlate. The questions are obviously related. It is conceivable that the activities aimed at producing otherness would have been intensified as a result of increasing differentiation in the doings of the two proto-communities. Vice versa, the rhetorically affected separation might have led the two communities to intentionally take, in their doings, routes not trodden by the other. But the two historical processes remain distinct, and different, not necessarily overlapping timelines may be envisioned for them. One could then rephrase the interrogation I'm proposing in terms compatible with Boyarin's thesis as a question about the intellectual tradition of the community whose doings were at some point, whether earlier, concomitant, or later, collectively called Judaism, as a result of the Christian adoption for itself and imposition on the other of the newfangled category of religion. When did that intellectual tradition come to diverge from that of the Christian inventors of religion? In other words, the field of observation for a description of the parting of the ways exceeds, though it certainly includes, the sum of rhetorical moves performed by actors in the process of identity production. This claim does not ask that we revert to identifying some core tenets of faith or praxis dear to either tradition as deal breakers, issues that prompted the separation. While it is true that Jews and Christians, particularly Christians, often constructed their separate identifications around such issues, making that leap would equal navigating historical reality by using the same maps through which battling historical actors agreed to represent their borders. A new survey of the territory is needed instead. Even revisionist studies, which date the parting of the ways to the end of late antiquity, have paid excessive attention to religious constructs. In the search for both moments of rupture between Christianity and Judaism and a putative Jewish-Christian movement escaping those fractures, paramount importance is often given to how key actors position themselves on questions central to the ancient Jewish religion. Issues such as the observance of the Mosaic precepts or the strict preservation of the divine monarchy. This tendency is exemplified by the scholarly treatment of binitarianism, a belief combining monotheism with the presence of a lower divine entity. Interest in exalted patriarchs, personified attributes of the divinity, or chief angels surfaces in the Hebrew Bible and is ubiquitous in First and Second Temple era Jewish literature, while the selective literary preservation by the rabbis has resulted in a dearth of late ancient evidence of divine deuteragonists. Based on what precious little has survived, there have been attempts to reverse the notion of a first and second century separation by showing that some Jews and Christians shared similar ideas of the divine. These reconstructions are founded on the assumption that religious constructs constitute the appropriate unit by which to measure consistencies between the two traditions. But this approach is only meaningful within a theoretical framework that presumes religious phenomena to be ultimately irreducible to other domains of human activity, a presumption that decades of theorization in religious studies have eroded. I propose putting in abeyance that essentialist premise, thereby sidestepping a host of methodological problems, in order to model the parting of the ways on the basis of processes shared by literate societies. Of course, bracketing off religion as a category pertinent to this examination does not require denying that the problems Jews and Christians attempted to address were of the kind that from late modernity onward would come to be defined as religious. Rather, the continuum out of which the two traditions emerged stood on a foundation of intellectual engagement with a common conceptual structure inherited from Second Temple Judaism, Jewish monotheism. Its fundamental problem could be expressed in the following way. Once a radically other deity is posited and endowed with subjectivity, how is one to understand humankind's relationship to this entity? Non-Jesus following Jews shared with Jesus following Jews and with the Gentiles who joined their ranks an interest in dealing with this theoretical tension. The focus on a discursive apprehension of the divine was hardly exclusive to Christian thinkers. Jewish sources exhibit a clear preoccupation with God and his activities. But around the 4th century, Jesus following and non-Jesus following actors began to engage differently with the monotheistic dilemma. Though addressing the same theoretical issues that busied rabbinic minds, the former set about to do so in their own ways, and increasingly since the 5th century, in manners that aimed at the establishment of correct speech about the divine. Eventually, their inquiries crystallized into a particular style of investigation, governed by a defined set of rules and sustained by a cohesive pattern of intellectual engagement. Classicists have long viewed the 4th century as the time of intellectual decline in the Roman Empire. The decreased literary production that marked this era puts in even greater relief the feverish scholarly activities of Christian intellectuals in the period between the early 320s and 383. These took a variety of coherent forms, including the release of synodal documents, the exchange of epistles, and the publication of doctrinal treatises. By virtue of the Trinitarian debates, the Christian theological production constituted by far the most conspicuous literary corpus of the 4th century from the viewpoint of high culture. Indifferent to sectarian divisions, the sheer density of literary transactions contributed to the constitution of a discrete tradition, through the ecclesiastical leadership's deployment of new principles and methods for the production of knowledge about God in the engagement with the monotheistic conundrums. The theology I'm discussing is thus to be understood as a research tradition, in the sense given to this term by Larry Loden. Quote, a set of general assumptions about the entities and processes in a domain of study, and about the appropriate methods to be used for investigating the problems and constructing the theories in that domain, end of quote. Intellectuals engaged in Trinitarian debate developed through their operations a series of processual assumptions about the study of the divine. These were then bequeathed to the Christian intellectual tradition, becoming as enduring a part of its identity as the particular points of faith contained in the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. 4th century theology, however, was not based only on innovative and idiosyncratic methodological tenets, but also on a novel set of practices. These included, for example, the recourse to councils to settle doctrinal disagreements, the evolution of the synod into a judicial body put in charge not only of settling issues of doctrine, but also of trying individual clergy members, and the establishment, through travel and epistolary exchange, of transregional episcopal entente, mediated by the granting, withdrawal, and withholding of sacramental communion. The research tradition that emerged from the Trinitarian controversies was embodied by a class whose intellectual activities crossed with their uniformity doctrinal partisan lines. Most importantly, theology was responsible for the production of a discursive field. The discursive field underlying the theological research tradition arose out of the competition between mutually delimiting positionings, vying over primacy of enunciated legitimacy. During the Trinitarian disputes, the engenderment of multiple positionings on the question of intra-divine relations led the proto-Christian positioning, originally inscribed within the discursive field that underlay the undifferentiated Christian-Jewish continuum, to rise to the status of a discrete discursive field. To be sure, complex phenomena of negotiation, convergence, intermixing, and boundary crossing among common Jews and Christians in the domains of praxis, belief, and even literary production are documented well past the end of late antiquity. Theologians and rabbis inhabited to a very large extent the very same social world. Though discretely constituted, the discursive field of theology and the one that came to be formed by rabbinic activities had spaces of interaction. In fact, strictly speaking, interactions are only possible within a state of distinction.